Let's take some time to talk about the ideologies of the Japanese Empire. How did the Japanese view the people and lands that they had accumulated, and how did they view themselves? More importantly, we need to understand the dynamism and constant change going on here. How did these views change over time? Because they absolutely change over time. There is no static, essential, constant definition of things like ethnic identity. These things are always changing. So let's first start with the empire itself, the territories, and the people who were in it. There was the fundamental spatial distinction to begin with. By the time you get to the 1920s and whatnot, and you've got the early empire established before World War II, your main spatial distinction is between inner or Naichi and outer or Gaichi territories. Inner versus outer. The inner ones were seen as the ones that were acquired earliest in the campaign and were most suitable for full assimilation and integration into the Japanese state. That is to say, if Japan never lost its colonies, these are the places that eventually would have added to the number of the Japanese home islands, so to speak. Instead of 4 home islands, you might have 7. Taiwan, Korea, not technically an island, but still Taiwan, Korea, and Karafuto. Karafuto, the southern half of Sakhalin Island to the north of Hokkaido. And these were seen as, they're capable of being fully assimilated or integrated into Japan. They'll eventually have representation in the Japanese parliament and basically be Japanese citizens. Now, this isn't going to happen overnight, but eventually that was the idea, is that these places are different. And they would bring all kinds of historical discourses to bear on this. Korea was said originally to be part of the same people, the same nation as Japan, and we had been estranged over the years. Korea corrupted by mainland China and whatnot, and northern barbarians from Inner Asia, and we're going to make them realize that they're actually our brothers, and we were originally the same people. Taiwan was also seen as sort of kind of like a blank slate. Taiwan and Korea are contrasts. Both of them were seen as suitable for full assimilation into Japanese. Koreans were already Japanese, they just didn't realize it. But with Taiwan, they were seen as sort of a lack of a prior cohesive expressed identity, political identity. It had only recently been incorporated as a province into the Qing Empire. There wasn't a strong Confucian Chinese gentry presence. A bunch of uneducated peasants speaking a southern Minnan Chinese dialect. Not much of this massive urban literate presence there. After Japan gets Taiwan, most of the Confucian elites leave. They go back to mainland China, leaving Taiwan sort of a mix of these Aborigine people, peasant illiterate settlers originally from Fujian province who don't even really speak Mandarin Chinese. And the Japanese look at it and say, there's no pre-existing identity here. We can easily assimilate them, bring them up to our level of civilization. Korea, a little bit different. Korea did have a long-standing, prominently expressed political and ethnic identity as we are, distinct. We are Confucians. We have partaken of Chinese culture, but China constantly gets corrupted by northern barbarians who invade it, and we have remained somewhat pure. That was very much the Korean conceit, is that we are the purest, original Confucian culture. And they had independent kingdoms and their own conceptualization. The Japanese found it very difficult to overcome this. They had their own script, their own writing script and whatnot. And so they always found, the Japanese found that in Korea, they often had to resort to the stick, whereas in Taiwan, they could resort to the carrot. Taiwan was a little bit less resistance than they encountered in Korea. And it seemed as though it was somewhat easier to get the Taiwanese on board with the Japanese education system, and for at least a good portion of the population, the literate urban elites, to be convinced that, hey, you can become Japanese. Whereas in Korea, there was a lot of resistance to that. There's also a lot more people in a more densely populated country, and it was always an antagonistic relationship in Korea, much more difficult to implement a program of Japanese assimilation. Nonetheless, Taiwan, Korea, Karafuto, all seen as eventually they'll be full Japanese. Okay? Then there were the outer colonies, the Gaichi. This included the South Seas, that's your Pacific islands that they got after World War I, ceded from Germany, which lost World War I. You had Southeast Asia, which they will eventually occupy militarily during World War II. And you also have their interest in northeastern China. The area that we think of as Manchuria. They had an army stationed there, soldiers to look after the interests of the South South Manchurian Railway Company. These places were seen as, they were acquired later. They were also seen as having a distinct identity that preceded our arrival, and as such, they are not necessarily going to be slated for full integration into the Japanese empire. They're going to be something a little more indirectly rules, and the idea here was that we're only exercising temporary stewardship until such time as we can nurture responsible modern states. Kind of similar to the idea of the mandate system in the Middle East after World War I that the British and French imposed on former Ottoman territories, saying, you guys aren't ready to be independent yet. We're a more advanced nation. We will teach you how to become a modern nation, and when you're ready, we'll set you free to be a responsible modern state just like us. In the meantime, we're going to be in charge because we're far more advanced than you. So these sort of areas, they would have the facade of autonomy. When the Japanese, took away Manchuria from China in the 1930s, they wouldn't just make it a part of Japan. They set up their own, supposedly independent nation state, Manchukuo, which was a puppet state completely under Japan's control. But they wanted to maintain the fiction that this was an independent state that we're just assisting, we're just helping. South Seas were actually literally a mandate. They were given to Japan as part of the mandate system after World War I. Southeast Asia as well. We're not conquering Southeast Asia. They're not becoming Japanese. We're just sort of uplifting them, liberating them from Western imperialism, exercising temporary stewardship over them, and then they'll become modern, responsible states, i.e. friendly to us and do what we want them to do. That's what they mean by responsible modern states. Okay, occupied China would be the same way during World War II. The areas of inland China that they managed to occupy, they would set up their own puppet state and say this is the reformed states of China, and they would have a Chinese leader, Wang Jingwei, one time rival to Chiang Kai-shek, set up as sort of the leader of this occupied state. Technically, it's supposed to be an independent state, or at least it's going to be one day. Japan's not saying this is going to be fully assimilated and integrated into the Japanese empire. I'm going to read a wonderful quote from a politician and journalist, Takekoshi Yosubura, on what he perceived as the Japanese civilizing mission for all of Asia. He said, quote, "Western nations have long believed that on their shoulders alone rested the responsibility of colonizing the yet unopened portions of the globe and extending to the inhabitants the benefits of civilization. But now we Japanese, rising from the ocean in the extreme Orient, also take part in this great and glorious work." The idea that we too have a civilizing mission. Our civilizing mission is going to take place in Asia. Usually we have to kick out the Western imperialists first, but then we're going to act similar to the way that they did, but better, because we're Asian and we understand Asians better and how to liberate them and bring them up to par much better. There was a widespread belief in Japan among some Japanese intellectuals that they were the whites of Asia. They were the whites of Asia. And Japan thus had its own Orient. There's a wonderful book, Japan's Orient. The idea that Japan, all of Asia was seen as the Orient to the West. Japan saw Asia as its own Orient as well, because we're token Westerners. We are the whites of Asia. And they even leveraged some biblical discourses about a lost tribe of the Israelites going east, and that became the Japanese. Pretty ridiculous stuff, I know. Nevertheless, they were viewing themselves as the white people of Asia, essentially tasked with a noble mission of liberating all other downtrodden, oppressed Asians and bringing them into Asian modernity. Other peoples in the empire were often viewed as savages, especially the further you got away from the Japanese metropole, and complete with Japanese Orientalist depictions of them, just as ugly as the sort of depictions that the Westerners had of Orientals themselves. All right, Aboriginal Taiwanese, the Micronesians, Papua New Guinea during World War II. A lot of times the Chinese were viewed with these Orientalist depictions as being dirty and backward. And yes, they had a great civilization, but that was all in the distant past, and they've lost all that. And we have to sort of bring them into the modern age, kicking and screaming if need be. Okay, only the Japanese have agency. Everyone else is not a blank slate, but a canvas upon which the Japanese will bring everyone up to their level eventually. In the meantime, we need to exploit your resources for this civilizing project. Sorry about that. Now, who were the Japanese themselves? A very important question. Ideas about race and ethnic identity changed dramatically over the course of modern Japanese history. Most people have no clue about this whatsoever. You go onto Wikipedia, you look at reference books, and you'll immediately see the line, Japan is the most homogenous nation in the world. Nonsense! How did the Japanese view themselves during the empire? The predominant discourse was that the Japanese race, the Yamato race, was formed through multi-directional migration and ethnic plurality. That is to say, we came from everywhere. There was no one, they were not taking pride in a pure single race that was superior to all other races. They said we came from everywhere and coalesced into the most superior race, but our origins are essentially mongrel. We are a mongrel race and we take pride in that. That's a source of pride and vigor. It also justified, conveniently, taking over the rest of Asia, since our origins are from all of you. Yes, we have some Mongoloid stock in us. Yes, we have Negroid stock, so that justifies our presence in Papua New Guinea. This sort of stuff. It was very convenient from a strategic point of view to say that the Japanese were a mixed Mongol race, and that's a good thing. A school textbook, Japanese school textbook in 1907 said the following, quote, "There is no country apart from Japan which includes the blood of so many various nations. This is why the Japanese are blessed with such a powerful ability to assimilate." How self-serving and convenient. However, it also reminds us of the predominant official discourse of who the Japanese were. No pure Yamato race. We include everyone. And we are going to bring you back into the fold. In 1942, a statement from the Japanese Ministry of Education during World War II said the following, quote, "The great Japanese Empire is not a state based on a homogeneous nation. All scholars agree that our distant ancestors were Tungusids, Mongolians, Indonesians, and Negritos. Also, the number of people who became naturalized as Japanese is large indeed. Japan took these various peoples in, and they intermarried and merged." So how did we get this present view of Japan as the most homogeneous nation on earth? That is actually a very recent legacy. Most people have no idea. This is only in the wake of World War II that the official view of who the Japanese people were changed. It's a legacy of the US occupation and the idea of we need to explain where Japan went wrong. It looked like they were becoming just like us, but if they were really becoming just like us, why did they fight us? So something must have went wrong. All right, it wasn't that it was inevitable that empires with competing strategic interests and access to resources would fight one day. Something went wrong, and we won the war, so we don't have to have any introspection. It must be the losers. Something went wrong with the losers to have them fight us. And so the idea is that Japan had made the mistake of expanding and incorporating people who weren't Japanese. All right, the idea of the desirability of a nation state, one nation with political borders that subsume just that entire nation, no diversity whatsoever. If you can create a perfect nation state, you'll minimize conflict. And Japan originally, so this new discourse said, was a peaceful nation state with one race, a pure Yamato race. All right, it didn't include anyone else. Remember the Japanese previously said the Koreans were part of the original Japanese race. Now they're saying, no, the Koreans were never a part of this, yet that was a mistake. And saying that they were encouraged you to try to assimilate them. No, they're separate. Okay, so there was forced repatriation of Koreans from Japan, saying, you were previously defined as Japanese. We defined you as Japanese. Okay, you're not Japanese anymore. Koreans in the Japanese Empire, especially those living in the Japanese home islands, went overnight from being Japanese to being back to Koreans. Okay, and had to be kicked out of Japan. Most Koreans were kicked forcibly out of Japan to try to create a Japanese nation state with one pure race that would have no cause for conflict with its neighbors, because that's what causes conflict, is when people try to conquer other peoples and think that they belong within their state. So the Allied victors, chiefly the American occupiers, forced Japan into a nation-state ideological box in accordance with pre-1895 borders. They identified the beginning of the empire in 1895. It said anything after this is illegitimate and is a perversion of the original state of the Japanese nation. What was the original state of the Japanese nation? There was no clearly articulated view of who the Japanese were. It was more often during the Tokugawa era seen in terms of class. There were the elites, there were the peasants, maybe occupation, the farmers, the merchants. There were people, you could talk about Japan, the land that, where the rising sun is and whatnot, but these were very rarely articulated. It wasn't the most predominant identity for most people. You were defined in terms of occupation or class or perhaps religion, not ethnic identity. This is something that is created. We create ethnic identities. Ethnic identity, ideas of race, or a situational state of mind. Yes, we have different skin colors, superficial, different bone structures and whatnot, texture of hair. This is all very superficial. They're not races. The definition of races changes over time, subjectively in accordance with our changing agendas. And we can see this so clearly with Japanese definitions of who the Japanese people are, what is a Yamato race, and who are all the people in our empire. There's no static view of it. It's constantly changing. And it changes again dramatically after 1945 to give us our current view of Japan as the most homogenous nation on earth. That is utterly absurd. That's an ideology institutionalized after 1945, put into the educational curriculum, and everyone now is convinced. We've educated ourselves to believe that there's such a thing as a Yamato race, that it's homogenous, has never been, incorporated other people. It's the purest race on earth, and Japan is the purest nation state on earth. We've convinced ourselves this is true now through generations of education, so we really do believe it. But it has very little to do with the actual reality. Because race is a situational state of mind. We'll finish off with a wonderful quote from Kamishima Jiro, a political scientist, in 1982, when he reflected on the changes in ideology about the identity of Japanese people that he himself had lived through in his entire life. He said, quote, "In pre-war Japan, everyone said that the Yamato nation was a mongrel nation, a mixed nation. However, after the war, something very strange happened. People, including the progressive intelligentsia, began to insist that the Japanese are a homogeneous nation. There is absolutely no foundation for the claim, but this baseless theory is rampant." He was a dissenter in a crowd of conformity, both the American occupiers and the people who have gone through the Japanese education system themselves to now believe. You've been educated to believe that there is such a thing as a pure Yamato race, and your boundaries now perfectly encompass it. The Japanese Empire was much messier, and it shows us how the evolution of the ideology of who the Japanese were and who the people they ruled over were. There was no essential definition of it. It's changing in accordance with the needs of every different generation and the geopolitical realities that they face.